I'll be back sometime after lunch.
Filler scene. Filler scene.
This axe is a real axe that has substance to it.
It's got a death curse!
Friday the 13th Part 2 was released a year after the first Friday movie, in 1981. The film was directed by Steve Miner, who served as a production manager and associate producer on the first movie, and the film was written by Ron Kurtz. This is the only film he has written without using a pseudonym. No year, so I guess it's present day. A large man...
Out came the sun.
Small child skips in the rain. A large figure follows close behind as the small child is called back inside.
Oh, Mom.
What is this, an apartment complex? In one of the rooms of this building is Alice, the sole survivor from the first Friday the 13th. She rolls around on the bed recounting all the action from the previous film like an Uwe Boll movie. For 5 minutes. The film's already 10 minutes shorter than the first movie, not even breaking 90 minutes. Making one think this is a fairly rushed production. In fact, this movie requires some behind-the-scenes knowledge to truly understand why the movie is the way it is. Friday the 13th Part 2 began production only 4 months after the release of the first film. With almost the entirety of the original characters dead, Part 2 was a confusing idea to the original creators Sean S. Cunningham, Victor Miller, and makeup and visual effects artist Tom Savini.
I don't know what in the world we could do for a sequel.
Jason is totally, unalterably dead.
And then I got the script, and Jason is running around. I thought, what are you doing? There is no Jason.
So they backed out. For those of you that don't already know, Alice, played by Adrienne King, was very reluctant to return to the series or act in another film after the first Friday due to an obsessive fan turned stalker that got so bad she began to fear for her life.
The stalking was not taken seriously back in 1980. He got into my apartment. Eventually, I had a gun to my head, and I was able to talk the fan down.
She was called back to film a scene that appeared at the beginning of the film. And here's how it goes. Alice has a nightmare about the first movie, walks around her apartment, talks on the phone with her mother, takes a 10-second shower, walks in the kitchen, and opens the fridge only to see the rotting head of Mrs. Voorhees. Then she is immediately stabbed in the neck by the killer. We're already 12 minutes through the movie. No. I want to know, did she pick up her mail this morning? They're going real slow on this. So, here's the thing. Adrienne King was convinced to return for the sequel, but she wasn't given a script. She didn't know her character would die until she got on set. She didn't even know the rest of the film had already been shot. All her dialogue on the phone, improvised. And the way the film was managed was amateurish and just irresponsible. Example 1 being that King was stabbed in the head when the prop ice pick didn't retract properly. This whole sequence was padding in order to loosely connect the films, and it makes for one bizarre cold open. They at least remembered that she was an artist, so they have that going for it. We arrive back in town.
If you are some dumb folks looking to just get murdered.
We open on 2 teenage counselors, Mick Jagger's cousin and a groupie. I'll try to refer to everyone as their character name this time. Jeff.
My name is Jeff.
And Sandra. They arrive into town on his truck and run over to the phone booth to ask their friend for further directions.
Look for a Dairy Queen.
He talks some product placement until they're interrupted by Ralph. His truck is towed in the background, they run after it, only for it to lead them to their friend, Ted. He's the comic relief, just because he looks like he is. No unnecessary music is added to these driving scenes, and the dialogue is a noticeable improvement to the first one. Sometimes it slips, though.
What the heck is that? Where'd this sucker come from?
Yeah, did it fall from the sky? You're in the woods, guys. It fell. I'm the one that knows you're in a horror movie, and I can't even tell if this is supposed to be a warning for them or not.
This place is spooky.
The killer watches them as they move it and keep on driving. So, if the intent was to warn them or prevent them from coming any closer to camp, you could have made the message a lot clearer, because I have no idea what you're doing. Campmaster Paul rings the bell, and the rest of the cast assembles like the land of underdeveloped characters. I should mention this about here. They're not at Crystal Lake. They're at a camp counselor training ground that's near Crystal Lake. So it's like I don't know, across the pond, like they're sharing the same lake. Butt shot, and her butt is shot at by... Okay, so this is Terry, that's Scott, and... Hold on, I'm just gonna roster off. Jeff, Sandra, Terry, Ted, Vicky, Scott, Paul, Mark, and the rest.
What we're gonna do over the next 2 weeks, if the rest of my staff ever shows up.
And Ginny, who shows up late. Paul leaves the group to have a sexually tense scene with Ginny.
Ginny, I was starting to worry about you.
Bullshit, Paul.
Ginny, put your car in the lot, okay? This place is starting to look like a Burger King. And keep clean during your menstrual cycle. Having trouble?
Okay, so the writing isn't great, but it is better.
You gotta treat them gentle. Just like kids. Use a little of that child psychology you're majoring in.
They're attempting at foreshadowing, and it's fine. It's just the way they bring up certain subjects is awkward. Like, telling us what Jenny's majoring in could be important later. Another thing about the writing, there's some choices in the movie that seem to be true to life, but don't further the story. I'm talking about the way the scene with Alice goes, very mundane and almost in real time, and the choice to have a staff meeting scene where key cast members' names are called, but we learn virtually nothing about them in the process. It's clearly more important that Paul and Ginny's relationship is established, so why have a meeting that makes their interaction with each other all the more awkward? Like, is the group supposed to wait for them, or... Okay, I guess it's over.
I don't want to scare anyone.
Good, you're not. Paul tells the counselors a ghost story about Jason, telling much of what happened in the previous film as folklore, and adding in some new twists about Jason himself, implying to the audience that he may still be alive, grown up, and waiting to kill in order to avenge his mother.
Jason saw his mother beheaded that night, and he took his revenge.
I'll talk about that later, but what's really interesting right here is that through his dialogue, we gather that Alice was killed 2 months after the events of the first movie. And this film currently takes place 5 years after the event of Alice's murder. You could have used the freaking year to be specified in this movie. What is the present? Characters interact briefly, but more attention is put onto Paul and Ginny.
Check. Mate.
Jeff and Sandra plot to visit Crystal Lake even though they were told not to.
You're not getting me out there. Besides, Paul said it was off limits.
We'll see.
And Ginny strips in the name of fan service. Paul sneaks in and sucks face with Ginny. Ralph watches them from outside the cabin and is killed. And Ralph's death doesn't make sense. The killer's just behind the tree, his arms already ready. Didn't have to swing the wire over to the other hand. He just was ready to go and went unnoticed. Super. Filler scene, morning run. Okay, I know I might be being nitpicky, but why are they running? You hired someone in a wheelchair. Is this just for fun, or is this a requirement for counselors? They hike, and Terry's dog wanders off to the killer. Funny juxtaposition. They make lunch, where Terry notices that her dog is missing.
Muffin? Here, girl.
They all go to the lake to swim, while Jeff and Sandra make their way to Crystal Lake to find the mangled remains of Terry's dog. Then they get caught by a cop. The past 10 minutes or so could have been cut down a bit, but again, it's an improvement from the original. While you could have got about 30 minutes from the first Friday and had the same sense of what's going on, this film does have some purpose in its scenes. The hike occurs so that we lose the dog. At lunch, Ginny puts away a chainsaw to be used later in the film. The group swims in the lake so that Jeff and Sandra can sneak off without being noticed and find the dog, showing that the killer is near, and later establishes for the audience what is real. And the cop is introduced after that so that in the next scene he can spot and chase down the killer in the woods, and also have an actual reason for being there at that time. Why is the cop here? It's not great storytelling, but it is a plot that's moving. Anyway, the cop runs after a man he suspects to be another trespasser, only to discover a makeshift house made in the middle of the woods. He walks through it and is killed by a hammer. Paul proposes to the group a night on the town. Paul, Ginny, Ted, and anyone that doesn't have a character name leaves for the bar. This leaves 6 people at the camp. Jeff and Sandra, Terry and Scott, Vicky and Mark. Pretty much the couples that have less screen time. Terry takes a cold swim, Jeff and Sandra do it upstairs, Vicky and Scott progress their relationship somewhat naturally. Scott takes Terry's clothes, gets caught in a trap, and they're both killed. I literally think I'm in a live-action adaptation of the Best Scooby-Doo episode. Jenny, Paul, and Ted sit at the bar, and we never see the other camp counselors that went with them again, which is good. Paul's crappy leadership saved them from being killed. Jenny talks about Jason as if Paul's ghost story earlier in the film might actually be true.
Oh, what if there is some kind of boy or beast running around Camp Crystal Lake?
Really though, a large part of this movie is devoted to convincing the audience that Jason is no longer a boy who drowned 27 years ago, but someone that was never found after they supposedly drowned, grew up in the woods, watched his mother die, and then sought vengeance through killing anyone that comes close to Crystal Lake.
He'd be grown by now, right? He must have seen his mother get killed. And he must be out there right now crying for a return. I mean, what would he be like today? Some kind of out-of-control psychopath?
And in the context of this film, everything that Jenny suspects is actually true.
Bizarre, isn't it?
This is a bizarrely stupid way to go with the story. Do I even need to explain the questions that are raised from this? Okay, if a body was never recovered from the lake, why didn't Mrs. Voorhees ever go out looking for him? If Jason didn't drown, why didn't he just go back to camp or go try to reunite with his mother? How does Paul know that this legend of Jason seeking vengeance if Jason has only killed one person, Alice, who wasn't even near Crystal Lake at the time of her death? How'd Jason know where Alice lived? If he could venture outside the woods, why did he go back into the woods? The truth is, the film makes no sense if you think about it too much. The story is ludicrous, and will drive you mad if you don't just accept what the characters believe to be true. The reason I'm frustrated by it still is because I came up with a way in which they could have done a better sequel. Now, bear with me, because I know this is getting into like fanfiction territory. Make Ralph the killer. Ralph is the town crazy, and his warnings to people carry no value to others.
God damn it, Ralph, get out of here!
After years of not being taken seriously, Ralph could have taken Mrs. Voorhees' loss to heart and began making claims about the camp in order to ensure the camp remained closed. After witnessing Mrs. Voorhees commit murder, in 1979 they could have formed an alliance, for her sake to avenge her son's death, and for his sake to prove that the camp is indeed haunted and that he's not crazy. Together they kill the camp counselors in the summer of 1980. This takes care of some of the problems I had with there just being one killer in the first film.
Are you telling me this woman threw one of them through a window, ran up the top of the hill, drove the Jeep down the hill,
and makes for a decent reason why he'd continue the terror years later? He would have had to keep their original goal that the camp must remain closed in order to prevent any more child neglect from happening, and so that he's not seen as the crazy person. Not a perfect story by any means, but it's at least plausible. Okay, back to the original movie. Vicky decides to freshen up for Mark. Mark dies. It's kind of funny, though, because she's the one that said she'd be right back, and she's not the one that's killed at that time, you know? It's... yeah. Jeff and Sandra finish, and then are impaled. You know, when I first saw this, I was really proud of the crew for not showing nudity when they could have, because it doesn't serve the story, and it feeds the wrong people. That is until I found out that they did shoot a more graphic sex scene between Jeff and Sandra, and it was cut when Paramount discovered that Sandra actress Marta Kober was underage. Example number 2. This production is awful and the people in charge are completely irresponsible. Jenny and Paul leave to head back to camp, and Ted stays at the bar.
Excuse me, are there any after-hours places around here?
Sure are.
Vicky comes back to the main cabin and can't find Mark, because he's dead. She heads upstairs to find Jeff and Sandra, and Jason. She dies. Wow, she was a passable actress before that scene. Jenny and Paul arrive back at camp where they discover the bed upstairs covered in blood. They head back downstairs and are attacked by Jason. Jason wears a burlap bag on his head and overalls. His attacks are outrageously clumsy, and the fights throughout this sequence appear rushed. I'm guessing they got all these shots in one take, and they may have just made it up as they went along. There are some decent stunts in this sequence though, like Jenny falling out of the window, as well as some pretty great tracking shots as characters run, and some effective jump scares here and there. We get some payoff with the chainsaw, and Jenny runs off into the woods and finds Jason's makeshift home. She finds a shrine where Jason has placed his mother's head and sweater, and surrounded it with candles and the bodies of the people he has killed. A nice touch is the significantly decayed body of what I would assume to be Alice. Jason is trying to break in, and with the time Jenny has, she decides to put on Mrs. Voorhees' sweater and pretend to be Jason's mother when he bursts in.
It's all done, Jason. You've done your job well, and Mommy is pleased.
As you can maybe see, Jason is just as confused as I am. The film mentioned earlier that Jenny was a child psychology major, and I think this is why they mentioned that. But I don't see why whatever is happening in this movie. I don't get it. There's a brief cameo of Betsy Palmer as it fades in and out of Jenny saying lines and Mrs. Voorhees saying lines.
They said, would I come and let them make up my head again, and that they needed that and do a few voiceovers. And I said, sure, I'll do that.
Mommy has
a reward for you.
So Jason believes Jenny to be his mother, until he sees the decaying head again and takes a swing at Jenny. Paul comes out of nowhere to save her. Him and Jason fight, then Jenny swings a machete into Jason's shoulder. He goes down, apparently dead. Paul and Jenny walk back to the nearest cabin and wait for anything that could happen. Paul at the door, Jenny at the window. He opens the door, and it's the dog. The dog from earlier, that we had apparently seen be violently mutilated.
Give me your mom.
This jump scare was way more effective than the previous film. But what the heck is even real here? A dog came back from the dead, Jason came back from the dead a second time, and the last scene of the movie is Jenny being carried away on a stretcher and into an ambulance. She calls out for Paul, and we don't find out what happens to him. The final shot is a push into the severed head of Mrs. Voorhees. And then the movie's over. The final example I have for the film being a crappy production is the way they credited Jason. Stuntman Steve Dash played Jason with the bag on his head throughout that whole final sequence. He even got injured on set and required medical attention on his hand during the scene in the shack.
She missed the pickaxe, and she came down on my finger.
A different man, Warrington Gillette, who did the one shot of Jason jumping through the window unmasked and maybe all the arm shots, Gillette was the one that was credited as Jason for the film. Dash was credited lower in the credits sequence as Jason's stunt double.
Final thoughts? This was a boring movie to review. Like, yeah, I can and I did tear this film apart for its moronic premise, but all it set out to do was continue the first film. It didn't have to be good, it had to exist in order to make money, and that's what it did. That being said, entertainment value is minimal. Like, the characters have a little bit more depth to them, they have a little bit more to do, but it's not very compelling. Another thing, the ratings board took this film to the cleaners, making for pretty weak kills in this film. Originally, there was going to be more blood in Ralph's murder. The scene of Mark's brutal machete to the face was shortened, and its worst loss, the impalement scene. Only some photos remain of what could have been the film's best kill. The film itself was sent to the MPAA 8 times, receiving an X rating each time. Only until substantial cuts were made did the film receive an R rating. So, it's a slasher movie without slash. As far as characters, acting, and the way the story progresses, it's a better film than the first one. But when it comes to the kills, the production values, and the various mishaps, along with the premise itself, it's far worse. Part of me prefers the first Friday the 13th simply because of its simplicity. It didn't have to convince me who the killer was or explain to me how the killer exists before offing anyone. The first Friday is stupid, pure and simple. But to me, the sequel just isn't that fun to watch. But hey, They set out to make a serial killer that they could make sequels out of. They got it.
Psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est?